Hi, and welcome to the Science of Adult Learning. I'm Dr. Ann Fensey, and I'm going to share some important information for you if you work with adult learners. In this video, I'm going to provide an overview of lifespan changes in cognition that may impact learning. Before I talk about how adults learn, I'm going to briefly address the learning process that is common in the majority of humans. In a person of any age, their mind is composed of long-term memory and short-term or working memory. So we can't see much here. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So long-term memory is where all of your knowledge, experiences, preferences, values, and identity are stored. Your brain has learned to organize this information into mental models or schema so that it is easier to use and more effective. You can picture networks here to represent the connections between all of the information stored in your mind. Working memory is where all of the work happens to use the information in long-term memory and to do the work of getting new information stored in long-term memory. You can use the image of gears here to represent all of the work your mind is doing when it is thinking. In addition, sensory perception and processing is also happening in working memory, so we can add an eye and ear here to represent that. It is important to note that while long-term memory is potentially limitless, working memory has a fixed capacity and varies by person and situation. Working memory and long-term memory are almost always working together in a top-down and bottom-up process. So, for example, your senses are doing the work of perceiving the world around you, but your long-term memory is helping to decide what to focus on and process. At the same time, once you perceive something, your working memory tries to recall anything similar in your long-term memory in order to process it. Once it finds something relevant, your working memory tries to link it to similar representations in long-term memory to store that information. I'm also going to add a heart here to represent the emotional aspects of learning, which includes emotional reactions in the moment that can enhance the integration of the new information, and motivation, which can help to direct attention to the particular information and determine how important it is to store it in long-term memory. Let me recap some important information to take away from this. First, knowledge is organized in our minds. If we understand how the knowledge of our learner is organized, we can use these mental models during the learning process to help students incorporate new information. This is one of the reasons why it is more important to get information out of our learners than it is to get information into our learners. Prior knowledge, emotions, and motivation informs what we focus on. Connections are usually required for learning. If there is no prior knowledge about a topic that you will be teaching, your learners will be lost and have a difficult time remembering the information. So metaphors can be really helpful here in providing proxy mental models that students can use to build new mental models of the information you're presenting. Learning requires thinking. Unfortunately, sleeping with a book under your pillow does not help you learn, and there's no way to plug a USB cord into a student's head and download information into their brains. That's just not how learning happens. Thinking has to happen for learning to happen. My favorite quote is from Daniel Willingham, who said, "Memory is the residue of thought." And there is a great project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education called Visible Thinking that offers lots of thinking routines that you can incorporate into your teaching to help students to think more about your content. Finally, working memory has an upper limit. There's only so much information that you can process at one time, especially if it requires conscious control. So you can manage this limitation by chunking course content and activities into smaller pieces, especially if the minds of your learners are occupied by other things, like being hungry, wondering why their friend is suddenly upset with them, or what their weekend plans are. Also, automated information does not place heavy demands on working memory. So the more you can automate information or help students to organize information into structures that align with their mental models, the more room they will have for thinking. This is why it's so important to learn math facts and memorize those so that when students are doing problem solving in mathematics, they don't have to use their working memory for the computation. They can actually use their working memory for the problem. Also, the more you can simplify learning activities and instructional designs, the less extra stuff the learner has to process, and the more they have available for thinking. Now, there are different types of memories that are encoded in long-term memory. Episodic memories are the experiences we have that we can recall. I have snapshots here to represent them, but that is a bit misleading. We don't actually record an exact replica of every experience we've ever had. Our brains just don't have the capacity to store all of that. So our brains try to select the most important bits from an experience and store those. But when we recall those memories, we're not playing back a video in our minds or looking at pictures. We're actually reconstructing the events in our minds. Another important thing to note about episodic memory is that we actually dually encode two versions of each experience, a more detailed version and a gist version, which includes just the essence of the experience or the overall meaning. This is called the fuzzy trace theory. The detailed and gist versions of memories are encoded separately, meaning they're formed separately, stored separately, and retrieved or remembered separately. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes. When you have multiple of the same type of event, your brain looks for patterns and meaning and semanticizes them. Then it becomes a part of semantic memory. So as annoying as it is when your toddler drops his sippy cup over the edge of his high chair over and over and over again, he is actually forming an understanding of gravity through repeated experiences. Semantic memory is usually organized into categories and can be concrete, like types of cups, or abstract, like gravity. Another form of memory is procedural memory, where we learn processes, skills, and to perform patterns with our bodies, like swimming or playing the piano. Now, implicit memories can include procedural memories once the procedures are automated to the point where we no longer need to consciously recall them, like walking. Other forms of implicit memory include priming, biases, and classical conditioning, like a dog salivating when he hears a bell ring. And then finally, prospective memory is the memory to complete a task at a future time. Let's summarize some important information to know about long-term memory. First, knowledge is formed through semanticized experiences and by updating mental schema with new information. This means that you should provide multiple varied experiences to improve learning so that students can start to identify patterns and rules among the various experiences and contexts. Practice is required for procedural memory. If there is a skill you want students to learn, like public speaking or multiplication, you have to provide plenty of opportunities for practice. And finally, remember that we form two memories of each version, a detailed version and a gist version. Now, I've given you a very oversimplified explanation of the learning process and memory, but it's important to provide this basic outline of the cognitive model of learning so that we can talk about how these things vary with age. So now let's talk about how all of these things change across the lifespan. First, we'll talk about the good news, since so many people equate aging with deterioration and loss of functioning. And that's not necessarily the case with aging, and especially with learning. The biggest asset adults bring to their learning is their prior knowledge. This includes a wealth of personal experiences to draw from in a lifetime of episodic memory, a vast network of mental schema, concepts, and vocabulary in semantic memory, practiced procedural memories, especially strategies that can be applied in a variety of contexts, and implicit memories, biases, and automated information that has been built up through experience. Unfortunately, we often design our instruction for an imagined typical student without acknowledging the potentially helpful information that adult learners bring to their learning. If we can elicit this prior knowledge from long-term memory from these adult learners, we can help them to improve their learning outcomes. Now, the flip side of all of this prior knowledge is that it can interfere with learning if the new content conflicts with their prior knowledge or beliefs. We might think that if you are presented with new information, you can just erase the old knowledge and replace it with the new knowledge. However, research has shown that rather than replacing the old knowledge with new knowledge, we actually keep the old knowledge and have to work to suppress it or ignore it in favor of the new information. And this takes mental effort and uses more brain resources. Actually, a recent study placed physics PhDs in MRIs and asked them to evaluate statements about physics that were scientifically based or naive understandings. So, for example, heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. So when we're growing up, that's kind of how we make sense of the world. We think that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. And it does seem logical, but then physics tells us that in the absence of air resistance, all objects actually fall at the same rate. So when they compared the statements like those compared to other types of scientific statements like the Earth orbits the sun in an elliptical path, they found that it took the physicists longer to respond to the statements that included naive understandings. Some physicists actually responded incorrectly, and more resources in the prefrontal cortex associated with response inhibition were engaged. So even experts in a field are still retaining their childhood understandings of the world around them and are using mental resources to suppress that naive understanding for their expert understanding. So let me demonstrate to you just how hard it is to suppress prior knowledge. So this is called the Stroop test, and it is a classical experiment used to measure response inhibition. If you have a stopwatch on your phone, go ahead and pull that up now, or just Google stopwatch in another browser window. So you can pause the video here and do that. Now, on the next screen, I am going to show you 4 columns of words for different colors. I want you to time how long it takes you to say each word on the screen. Read them aloud as quickly as you can, but be sure you are accurate. Ready? Okay, so that probably took around 10 seconds, maybe a little more or less. Now I'm going to show you 4 columns of words again, but this time I want you to say the color of the font, not the name of the word, and time yourself again. Again, say them as fast as you can, but be sure you're accurate. Ready? That probably took a lot longer and was a little bit more difficult. Why? So you were probably tempted to read the words rather than say the color. We are so used to reading, and we've actually learned some words so well that they are now part of our implicit memory, meaning we don't even have to think about them. When you see this list of words, your brain wants to automatically see the words, and you have to work hard to suppress that tendency to think about and say the colors instead. So even if you now know something that is correct, your mind is still using energy to ignore the old information, just like you were trying to ignore the words in front of you to say the colors you were seeing instead. So let me highlight a few important things to know about long-term memory in adult learners. First, you can vastly improve learning outcomes if you intentionally connect your course or training content to the prior knowledge adult learners bring to learning. This is vitally important as the majority of learning comes through making connections with what we already know. Rather than you always coming up with examples of a concept you are teaching, ask the adult learners to provide examples from their own experiences. Find ways to elicit background knowledge to identify any potential misconceptions or biases. This could be done with a pretest, a brain dump, or a KWL chart. And then when you find those conflicts, help the adult learners to automate the new knowledge so it is easier to recall when they are suppressing the old knowledge or belief. And this can be done with retrieval practice strategies like flashcards or practice quizzes. Now, practice quizzes can be especially beneficial if the misconception is one of the incorrect answers, so the learner gets practice choosing the correct understanding. Finally, the increased mental processing needed to suppress old knowledge in favor of new knowledge takes extra energy and time. If you have an assessment that requires students to suppress prior knowledge in favor of new learning, be sure the adult learners have enough time to respond intentionally. Now let's go back to the cognitive model of learning and talk about some of the components that change across the lifespan. As I mentioned, the content of long-term memory expands greatly throughout the lifespan. But the working memory or short-term memory is fixed. It does become increasingly more difficult throughout the lifespan to recall information though, and identifying the source of information is even more difficult as episodic memories begin to blend together. Give adults more cues to help them remember. And then remember I mentioned detail and gist memories? So it turns out that children generally rely on detailed memories and often have a difficult time forming a gist memory or finding essential meaning. As they grow older, they gradually gain the skill to develop gist-based memories and rely less on detailed memories. Throughout younger and middle adulthood, we continue to build our gist-based memories and start to lose the detailed memories. This is another strength that adult learners have, the ability to see the big picture and the essential meaning in a lot of our course content. And this is typically the kind of learning that matches our learning objectives. However, in practice, we often emphasize details in our teaching. On top of that, we often assess for details in higher education when what we really want is for our students to understand the big picture and the essential meaning of our course content. If an adult learner is looking at a multiple choice question like this about a course concept that includes distractors or incorrect answer choices with minor variations from the correct answer, they are going to be at a disadvantage compared to children or traditional age college students. So here are some important things about forming and retrieving memories that are helpful to know when working with adult learners. First, when you introduce a topic, begin with the big picture, like the essential meanings students should make or the overarching explanation you want them to remember. Then, illustrate this with multiple detailed examples and help the students find the patterns in these examples which help them to find the essential meaning or overarching explanation. Next, do not assess details unless they are essential for meaning or learning outcomes. If you are teaching about women in American society, perhaps it's not essential to remember the exact date of the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, but it may be important to know that it was in the middle of the 19th century, and it was around the same time that the first woman graduated from medical school. If you're teaching a unit on infection control in a nursing program, it is essential that students understand the appropriate use of personal protection equipment, or PPE, but they don't necessarily need to be assessed on the details of the mechanisms of each type of PPE unless it is essential for a learning outcome. For example, if they are addressing the prevention of the spread of COVID, it would be important for them to understand which PPEs prevent the spread of aerosol-type pathogens. Finally, and this can be helpful for all learners of all ages, use graphic organizers or model illustrations to visualize the structure of information in the concepts you're teaching. This helps all learners to see the big picture, but it also helps learners to identify when details are important to remember. Now let's look at working memory and changes across the lifespan. Remember, this is where all the thinking and cognitive processing happens. And there is evidence in the research that this process begins to slow down in early adulthood, then gradually continues to slow throughout the rest of adulthood. It doesn't mean that adults can't process the same amount of information, it just means that it takes more time. Working memory is also where sensory processing occurs, and there is evidence that sensory perception and processing begins to decline in about middle adulthood, especially our ability to ignore sounds. Another brain function that is related to working memory is attention. As I've mentioned before, long-term memory can help us in a top-down approach to help us to focus on particular sensory input or thoughts. Researchers have studied many components of attention. This includes sustained attention, or the ability to keep your attention on a goal-directed focus and ignore distractions for a period of time. Attentional selectivity, which is the ability to focus on one thing among a number of competing stimuli. And attentional capacity, which is the amount of things you can focus on at a given time and for how long. And all of these have been shown to decline slightly throughout the lifespan. And all of these are directed by executive attention or cognitive control, which does not fully develop until our mid-20s, and it does show a little decline throughout adulthood into old age. Selective attention is our ability to focus on relevant information and suppress distractions, and this ability gradually declines throughout the lifespan. It's also important to note that when we move our attention from one stimulus to another, we need to keep the original content in working memory, like the reading assignment you're working on for your class. And if you have a distraction, like children arguing upstairs, when we shift our attention back to the reading assignment, there is some evidence that the distractor, like the noisy children, stays in our working memory for a longer period of time as we age, continuing to disrupt our focus even though we have returned to the reading. Now, I conducted a study of academically high-achieving working mothers as they participated in their distance education courses, recording their screen, webcam, and audio during their study sessions. And we saw an extraordinary amount of distraction, mostly from the home environment. And we noted that when the students engaged with the distractor, it took them longer to refocus on their assignment than when they were able to ignore the distractor. Finally, divided attention refers to the ability to focus on multiple tasks or stimuli simultaneously. One study found that older adults were completing a single task performed as well as younger adults who were multitasking. Another researcher found that the cost of multitasking, which was inaccuracy on the tasks they were completing, increased linearly with age. And this is important to note because adults are often required to do more multitasking because of the multiple competing demands they have on their time. It is also important to know that there really is no such thing as multitasking. We're actually quickly switching our attention between two tasks, and our skills with this declines with age. So let's do a little experiment. You can pull up your stopwatch again, or I'll have one on the screen. And this time, I want you to say the alphabet as fast and accurately as you can while you time yourself. Ready? Okay, now I want you to count to 26 as fast and as accurately as you can while you time yourself. Ready? Okay, now if you added those two up, that's how long it takes you to say the alphabet and count to 26. But what if I asked you to multitask and switch back and forth between them? So I want you to say a letter and a number, as fast and as accurately as you can while you time yourself. So for example, you would say A1, B2, C3, D4. Okay, ready? Go. I'll stop you there because it's probably a lot more difficult than you anticipated. And it takes you a lot longer than saying those things individually. So this is an example of quickly switching your attention back and forth between two different things. Whenever you switch your attention, there is a cost to your performance, either in accuracy or time. McAvenue and his colleagues in 2012 studied sustained attention, attentional selectivity, and attentional capacity across the lifespan. So I'm going to show you what one of those experiments looked like. You will see letters flash on the screen for a split second in either red or black. So you'll say the red letters aloud, but don't say the black letters aloud. Ready? So how'd you do? The researchers measured the speed and accuracy of reporting the letters correctly. So this chart from the research article shows the average maximum number of letters reported by age group. So notice that this peaks in adolescence and gradually declines throughout adulthood until a sharper decline in old age. They also looked at the efficiency, so the accuracy and speed of the selection, with a score of 0 meaning perfect accuracy and higher values showing more inaccuracy. So there's a somewhat similar pattern, but upside down as the measure is reversed. So there is a peak of accuracy in early adulthood, followed by a dip in the 30s and minor fluctuations in later years. What's really important to understand, though, is that these are just averages. If we look at all of the scores individually, we can see that there is a lot of variability. This chart shows the number of letters correctly identified as read by each individual. So while they are clustered in a pattern, there is quite a range of performance at all age levels. The same with efficiency of selection. In this chart, lower numbers are better with more accuracy, but there's still quite a bit of variability in each age group and similarity between age groups. It's actually harder to detect a pattern here because there is so much variability. So, important things to remember about attention when working with adults. Attentional resources decline slightly over the lifespan in lab settings with no distractions. And attentional capacity shows the largest decline. However, lifestyle conditions are not reflected in these lab studies. So attentional demands are likely higher for most adults, leading to potentially less attention directed at learning activities or shorter periods of sustained attention. And then finally, variability is the norm. While there is a trend of decreasing resources, it is very slight and there is a lot of overlap between age groups. Some adults in their 50s have better attentional resources than some adults in their 30s or some children in their teens. So plan for variability in ability, which can also vary situationally. A great resource to help understand and plan for this variability is the Learner Variability Navigator from Digital Promise. They show all the different ways that adult learners can vary, and they have corresponding strategies that might help you to plan for that variability. So to wrap up, I want to highlight the most important things to consider when designing or facilitating instruction for adult learners. First, adults are more different than the same. Variability is the rule. So especially because they have had a very diverse life and they have very diverse episodic semantic memories, they're going to be very different. Next, make use of all that prior knowledge. All learning happens through connections to prior knowledge, so help the adult learners make those connections. And then finally, because of these challenges that they do face with some declining resources, especially processing and attentional capacity, make sure that you chunk learning activities into smaller pieces so you accommodate for the slower processing and competing life demands. So in other words, instead of having them watch a 30-minute lecture video, chunk that up into 5 or 7-minute videos with a knowledge check question in there to help them maintain their focus rather than trying to multitask and watch the video while they're doing something else. So if you have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is on the screen, and if you scan the QR code here, you can find me and follow me on LinkedIn. Thank you.